Hello, I am Luch.Adore, and today I adore exploration. This is my loose show on things I'd like to teach about. Typically, this will be centered on TTRPGs, especially Dungeons & Dragons, but it's likely to include discussion of and references to other games that I find myself working with. I host a game for my friends that's been going on relatively well for a few years now, but other than that, I'm an avid reader, a writer, a gamer, hobbies, whatever. Anyways, today, I would like to explore how exploration works in 5th edition D&D. What is exploration? How does it contribute to how the game works? Is it good? Is it bad? Why it matters? This is the first subject for this series because it's personally my favorite aspect of the game, and I think the way D&D uses it deserves some examination. So for the scope of this video, I will be describing how exploration in Dungeons & Dragons is predicated on a cycle of play that is motivated by a focus from every player at the table to discover what happens in the game, because that kind of motivation exemplifies the experience-forward nature of the game, where the actions of the story are supported by the rules, but what happens in the game is decided by what the players do. So, what's important about exploration? Well, in order to get started, I'd like to make a few references to the introduction section of the 2014 Player's Handbook, abbreviated, in order to show how the game chooses to answer a few questions about how it's meant to be played. First one being, how will playing feel? It's about picturing the towering castle beneath the stormy night sky and imagining how a fantasy adventurer might react to the challenges that scene presents. In other words, picture a towering castle and imagine what an adventurer might do. Your DM has to want to describe an interesting situation, and your players have to want to think up ways the adventurer, not the player, will engage with it. How will playing work? Players roll dice to resolve whether their attacks hit or miss, and whether their adventurers can scale a cliff or pull off some other dangerous task. Anything is possible, but the dice make some outcomes more probable than others, which is to say, roll dice to see what happens when someone does something dangerous. Your group has to be interested in seeing what happens when the adventurers engage with danger. It's not about wanting to see your hero climb the cliff face, it's about thinking that he would try and wanting to see what happens when he does. What will happen in play? Working together, the group might explore a dark dungeon, a ruined city, a haunted castle, a lost temple deep in a jungle, or a lava-filled cavern beneath a mysterious mountain. The adventurers can solve puzzles, talk with other characters, battle fantastic monsters, and discover fabulous magic items and other treasure. Which, in addition to being a plug for the official adventures, means work together to explore fantastic locations, talk, fight, solve puzzles, and find loot. Your group has to be united in its desire to find and experience unexplored places, tackle problems that are designed to be difficult to solve, and discover desirable things. What is the goal of play? This is probably the most important one. There's no winning and losing in Dungeons & Dragons. Together, the DM and the players create an exciting story of bold adventurers who confront deadly perils. Sometimes an adventurer might come to a grisly end. Even so, the other adventurers can search to revive, or the player might choose to create a new character to carry on. The group might fail to complete an adventure successfully, but if everyone had a good time, they all win. In short, search for a way to do the impossible, like save a dead comrade, because the goal is to have fun, and that's all that matters. Which means your group should be expecting to have to look for a way to accomplish their goals. They shouldn't be expecting for there to be an obvious path forward, especially when that goal is self-serving as opposed to service for others. And as a bonus, your group should have self-serving interests that they are pursuing. Here's why that in particular is the most important point, though all of these sections from the introduction encourage this idea. What does this say about what this game is, and what does that have to do with exploration? These references all come from the first page of the Player's Handbook, the first introduction page, at least. So it's not really meant to show you the tools that we're going to be using to fulfill these expectations, but these expectations are meant to show that this game of Dungeons & Dragons is not about a DM writing or buying a story and players following along. It's not about players trying to reach a good ending while the DM runs the simulation. To me, this introduction is completely in line with the overall design of this game, as a game that is clearly focused around discovering or exploring what happens. This can be very difficult for people used to treating games like this as something that's winnable, because ultimately what this book is asking for is for the players to separate themselves from their characters, and the DM to separate themselves from the world. Both sides of the table are meant to be working together in unison to explore what happens next. I've heard a lot of people, sometimes even myself, blast this game from orbit over how little support it provides for exploration when it claims to be one of the 3 supporting pillars of play. But I think adopting this discovery mindset recontextualizes the rules provided to be plenty for what a game needs when it needs it. So part 2, what does exploration look like? So, bearing in mind that these rules are meant to support a game that the group motivates with an internal desire to explore what happens, what mechanisms does 5th edition D&D provide in order to accommodate exploration? Well, the first point of confusion seems to me to be that each of the 3 pillars of play are supported completely differently. Combat is a comparatively sturdy series of procedures that can become so familiar that without an intentional discovery mindset, it becomes a formulaic, foregone conclusion. Social interaction, on the other hand, is an incredibly open assumption with minimal rule support so that it can be fulfilled in whatever way is comfortable for your personal game's context. But exploration is mostly a collection of contextual rules meant to be called upon when needed and be tweaked and replaced or otherwise ignored whenever they're irrelevant. So where and what are the exploration rules? Specifically, the rules for exploration are found spread across multiple places between the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. In the Handbook, we find all of these rules. In Chapter 7, we have how to search for something hidden. Passive perception notices everything within its ability, and actively searching calls for a perception check with the specific method of searching informing the outcome. Which basically means that if you're trying to look for something, you have to describe how you're looking for it, because if you couldn't find it by doing it that way, then it doesn't matter what you roll, you weren't looking in the right place. How to hide says to make a stealth check if you're unseen, which is compared to anything around's passive perception, unless they're actively searching, in which case use the same rules for searching for something hidden. These two are probably the most mutual rules in the sense that the DM and the players are both going to be facing these rules on a regular basis. Chapter 8 has what is the cycle of play. That is, the DM describes the context, players dictate actions, and the DM describes the consequences. Repeat. This is also in a few other places in the book, but it's relevant here. How to measure time, basically at whatever rate counts. If seconds count, then we're counting seconds. Minutes, hours, days, you get it. How to move. What speed to move at, the consequences of doing so, as well as specific stunts like jumping. What you can do while you're moving. In this sense, I'm talking about when you're moving through the world. Just about anything, basically, but recommended options are navigating, foraging, mapping, tracking, or nothing, which is what is required in order to keep an eye out. That's talking about using the passive perception for discovering hidden things. See how it's all coming together. Some of the dangers of the environment are the consequences of falling and choking. We've got the influence of light, which is what you can see and what you can't. As an aside, don't forget that dim light is considered lightly obscured, meaning passive perception and perception checks are at disadvantage. Looking at you, dark vision. Food and water needs. Unless you're really, really small, or a horse, or bigger, you need a pound of food and a gallon of water a day, and you'll be exhausted if you don't have it. It's dead simple. In the guide, we find, in Chapter 3, how to make an adventure to be explored. How to make encounters, to meet when exploring and to be explored. How to make and use random encounters, again, to be explored while exploring. How to make a dungeon, to be explored. How to travel through the world when it isn't important, which is mostly advice for quicken travel that you know as the DM are otherwise going to be uneventful or nothing is going to happen. How to travel through the world when it is important, which is more detailed advice about travel where every unit of time could be important, and the unit of time varying on the context and the scale, usually minutes when you're traveling in an indoor environment like dungeons, or hours and days if you're overland. You get it. How to populate a world with things to be explored, things like our landmarks and, locations of interest. How the world can affect the players, which are influences to be explored through or despite, or, This is your weather rules, your climate hazards, and rules for how much food or water can be found in a given region, or how to get lost, which at this point in the game is only a time sink of about 1 to 6 hours, which isn't the worst, but it can certainly add up, especially if you aren't making progress. Chapter 8 is how much of the world to use, which is the scale of your maps and how big your world should be, or how much to track at a given moment. How to move when you're special, which flying, driving, sailing, oh my. When should people get noticed, which is basically a DM's facing rehash of the how to hide section. And how to follow other people, or tracking, which is kind of self-explanatory as well, but it's really nice to have the suggested DCs. Other than that, and the tables to generate a dungeon in the appendix, that's basically everything these books have to say about the act of exploring the world. So what's up with these rules? The nature of this system, and the way it's designed to function, is that your group already knows or needs minimal assistance in deciding what is a fantastic adventure. You know it when you see it, or you should. But just because you know what a fantasy adventure should be, doesn't mean you know everything about making it happen. So, rather than stress yourself about whether or not a cunning rogue would notice a particular hidden track, deciding amongst yourselves, the DM can just reference the rules for how to search for something hidden, and after that question is resolved, you and your group can carry on making your adventure, exploring the world. In other words, you guys should basically be doing this on your own, and when you need the help, you can ask the rules for help. This is a very functional system, as long as the desired information is available, which means it has to, first of all, exist, and it has to be accessible. And personally, I think we have a pretty extensive list of information here, and everything that I could desire, and I also think that the principles set by the list are sufficient that if something were missing, I would probably be able to make my best guess work well enough for whatever the moment is, especially if I have the assistance of the players on that particular matter, which, unless they're brand new players, they almost certainly will have a suggestion on how it can be rolled. And if you actually take the time to read these rules, I think you will be pleasantly surprised at how many of the sticking points that get hand-waved away because parsing them is too time-consuming are actually addressed in a usually really accommodating manner. I read this whole book cover to cover, and I mean in order, 2 times now, and it was only in researching for this topic that I actually realized that while I knew that the using different ability scores for skill checks rule was optional, the ability checks themselves are the assumed default form of check, and the skill checks are intended to be applied if they're deemed appropriate for the situation. This whole time, I had been over-relying on skill checks for things that probably didn't deserve the potential proficiency bonus because I just, glossed over reading that section in detail. And that's a level of game mechanic assumption that only really happens either out of laziness or because of consistent behavior in the play culture that cultivates a sort of character a sheet ability mindset that treats the things that you see on your sheet as like a menu of options or the buttons available for interaction in a video game, which is the sort of things that means players are going to declare that they'd like to make a perception check instead of search the area for signs of danger. However, I also think that the way that these rules have been arranged is ineffective for referencing in the moment of desperation. Part of the shortcoming is literally the arrangement, which I can understand putting the rules for hiding with dexterity, but it honestly would have been much easier to check how well a creature with dark vision can see something hiding in the dark if the rules for hiding and the rules for light weren't hiding from each other. It puts the DM, who is the default source for rulings, in an uncomfortable position where they need to balance at least 2 books in addition to whatever tools and references they're using to run their specific adventure. Despite this, overall, this system really does have a sufficient abundance of rules to facilitate exploring the world, as long as the people playing the game aren't expecting the rules to be a regiment or procedure that's meant to carry your story of adventurers to where they need to be for what needs to happen to happen. If you can develop a familiarity with the actual rules, or devise a more intuitive system for you to seek these rules when you need them, you'll open up a really exciting opportunity for exploration both in the story of the game, like crawling through dungeons and stuff, and the story of your game, like how your game develops and progresses. So that brings us to the last part. What can we do with exploration? Well, probably obviously, we can use the system to explore a wilderness environment. We already have rules for the essential concerns of gameplay like this. We've got food and water that can potentially be found in the wild, and while food is relatively cheap and light, water is a little bit more difficult to reasonably carry in abundance, and a little more critical to have on time. So unless we have a way to deal with that, we probably want to forage when water skins start to run dry. Traveling cautiously requires a slower pace. It means that the party is more likely to spot dangers before they've been spotted themselves, meaning either a chance for a surprise attack or avoidance, or the encounter otherwise just starting on the party's terms. But we also have support for making that wilderness exploration an entire adventure in and of itself, potentially more involved and maybe even more interesting than whatever's on the other side. Encountering strange locations, either accidentally or seeing landmarks worth investigating before continuing onwards. Troubles and boons that make continuing either a trial or a breeze, and random encounters that can either help or hinder depending on who's along for the journey and how they behave themselves. In other words, what your adventurers do to influence the outcome of an encounter, instead of just assuming that it means brutal fighting to the death. Whether that changes as the days pass, making it frightening to push through blinding rain or fog, or taxing to push forward in oppressive heat or stalling cold, just remember to keep the focus on the interactive parts that make these kinds of journeys interesting, if not exciting. Months pass in The Lord of the Rings with less than a page, because acknowledging that it happened in order to continue the story was the best way to make that adventure enjoyable to read. Not every single minutia needs to be explained, just the ones that make a difference. But these rules aren't just for recreating the Oregon Trail. The same tools and principles turn the minute-to-minute moments into meaningful decisions and unpredictable developments. The order the party walks in through the dungeon might mean life or death for whoever's on the sharp end of a swinging blade trap, tragically unnoticed until it's too late because the perceptive ranger was occupied trying to follow the trail of the goblins they're after, and the otherwise insightful cleric is mapping their progress in order to notice strange gaps in the layout of the dungeon where secret rooms might be hiding if they can search and find them. The party may be unable to risk moving slowly enough to be stealthy if a time constraint turns every minute walking into less time to save a hostage, but if they rush, who knows what kinds of terrors or treasures might spring out at them or be left by the wayside. And the cluttered office of a political enemy is rife with hiding places for critical intel and finery for the taking, but his personal safe is nowhere to be seen. Could it be in the wall, behind a painting, under his bed, concealed by magic? It might be underneath the ornate rug, but nobody remembered to listen at the door for the approaching footsteps of the guard. All of these are great examples of how your players' decisions and exploring what an adventurer, their adventurer, would be doing means that they are taking the time to search one thing, which inherently means they aren't spending that time searching for another, and that could have incredible repercussions. Just bear in mind that a great deal of work is required for these kinds of adventures and scenes to happen and to turn out interesting, and it's incredibly easy to arrange your group's game so that that work falls squarely on the DM's shoulders. The DM is responsible for arranging and delivering the context and finding rules when uncertainty arises, so it can be easy for either side of the table to make the game's progression and the drive their responsibility as well, because after all, they should know how to continue from here, right? But while a DM can fool themselves into thinking that they should, if everyone playing is actively playing and motivated by the discovery mindset, there's really no need for the DM to burden themselves with figuring out what the players should do in addition to everything else, because that's not what the players should do. What the players should do is whatever it is that they think their characters would do, and working together to pick those things out as what would be interesting and make for a fun experience for everyone, not necessarily the optimal decision for the greatest or most efficient or most desirable technical reward or outcome. All this leads into exploration and interactivity. It can be incredibly tempting to get rid of systems from your game that don't feel like they'd be fun to deal with. And honestly, if you give them a try and they don't fit your group style, then nobody should fault you for focusing on the parts of the game that you're playing that you enjoy. But many of the rules the game puts forward are intended to create situations where decisions can have impacts that extend far into the future of the game. Things like encumbrance and ammo and food or water can seem tedious, like it's just a burden that you're choosing to put on yourself to manage for the reward of being burdened. But by removing these aspects from the game, you remove potential for conflict and thereby excitement. It's awfully hard for you to find yourself in the middle of a desert and on the brink of death without food or water if you never were tracking food to begin with because it didn't matter, and the DM never really made anyone test for exhaustion from heat because wouldn't it be annoying to reach the tomb and have to fight the undead with disadvantage the entire time? Think about how much more exciting it is to pass a forage check to spy a freshwater spring in the wilderness after you've failed several days in a row than to just wake up on the other side of the forest because nothing happens and you've arrived at your destination exactly the same as you left. Isn't it a little bit more heroic to battle evil when the odds are stacked against you, rather than just when you have nothing to fear because you got all your abilities back on a long rest right after arriving at the mouth of the dragon's lair because you just slept right there at the entrance? And yeah, the dragon definitely didn't feel any need to check the entrance of his cave and spot a bunch of adventurers waiting around to kill him. And furthermore, making the decisions required for the odds to not be stacked against you is a lot more personally satisfying if it was something that your group personally decided instead of just assuming would be best if we all agreed that it just happened that way. In closing, I want to reiterate that exploration is at the heart of this game. The three pillars are combat and social interaction and exploration, and you can play games that heavily feature any combination of these game aspects. You can have a game where you fight monsters, but there's really no question about what's around the corner. And you can have a game where the spiderweb of faction players is complex and treacherous, but you always know what everyone's plans are because all it takes is someone to tell you. And you can explore a dungeon or the wilderness or settlement and have nothing exciting happen because it's always the same thing. It's just the backdrop for what you are really doing. But when you put the desire for exploration into your game, it's like a fire that warms the entire room. Your combat is filled with tension about whether or not your foe has more going on than it seems, and if you're even in a state to survive another battle. And your social encounters reveal more about your characters than any one player could have known and put in their backstory. And your world will be alive with mystery and danger that just begs for bold heroes to embark into the unknown, because they're certain that no matter which direction they go, they're on an adventure, and you and your friends playing Dungeons and Dragons are here to find out what that adventure is. Thanks for watching this video. I chose a big one for my first foray into somewhat serious uploads, and I'm pretty satisfied with how it's gone, more or less. The next video is going to be about social interaction, and I think it should be quite a bit tighter in scope than this one. The script for this video got away from me pretty quickly, and took a lot of work to focus down into the one or two main ideas that it hopefully is. It was really hard not to spend hours writing about completely different subjects in the middle of explaining a point that would inevitably be cut down for clarity regardless. Anyways, again, thanks for watching. I plan on uploading a video essay thing like this every week this year, and I already have a pretty long list of video topics to go through. But if you have any suggestions for things that you'd like to see expounded on with regards to Dungeons & Dragons or TTRPGs in general or specific, leave a comment. It's not like I have all that many to read that I'll miss it, right? If you like the video, give it a like, subscribe, and if you want to see videos as they come out, you can turn on the notifications or whatever. I promise you'll only sometimes see poorly edited footage of me playing games with my friends. I can't make any promises about profanity, though. Sorry. Bye-bye.